Right now, beneath one of the densest forests on planet Earth, there are cities, not villages, not campsites, cities with avenues, plazas, pyramids of earth, and roads that run straight through the jungle for kilometer after kilometer, connecting settlements that were built and inhabited more than 2,000 years ago. For 5 centuries, European explorers walked over the top of them and saw nothing but trees. For 200 years, the greatest archaeologists in the world insisted these cities could not exist, that the soil was too poor, the climate too hostile, the land too hungry to feed a civilization. They were wrong. And here is what almost no channel will tell you. The proof was there the entire time. It was simply hidden under a green ceiling so thick that no human eye could ever see through it. Then a laser changed everything. In this documentary, we will follow the technology that peeled back the forest like a curtain, revealing a lost world of engineers who reshaped the largest jungle on Earth into a garden. We will meet the oldest known cities of the Amazon, the pyramids of Bolivia, and the black soil that should not exist. And at the very end, we will confront the most haunting question of all. How does an entire civilization vanish so completely that the world forgets it was ever there? Stay with me, because the answer will change the way you see not only the past, but the future of our planet. Before we begin, I want to ask you something small, and it truly makes all the difference. This channel is independent and it is small. There is no television network behind these investigations, only careful research, verified sources, and long hours of work. If you enjoy listening to a good story while you relax a bit, you're on the right channel. If you value honest, deep explorations of history and science, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a like on this video and share it with someone who loves a real mystery. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, because it genuinely inspires us to keep going. Thank you sincerely for being here. Now, let us fly over the Amazon, and then let us look beneath it. To understand why these discoveries shocked the scientific world, you first have to understand the story that came before them. For most of the 20th century, science believed in an idea so powerful that it shaped every textbook, every expedition, and every assumption about the Amazon. Scholars called it environmental determinism, and the simplest version goes like this. The Amazon, they said, is a green desert. Yes, it is bursting with life, but almost all of that life is locked inside the trees themselves, not in the ground. The soil beneath the rainforest, they argued, is thin, acidic, and desperately poor. Strip away the canopy and you are left with dirt that farmers call feral souls, pronounced fe-er-ale souls, red and orange earth so lacking in nutrients that a cleared field goes barren within a few short seasons. From this single fact, an entire worldview was built. If the soil could not support intensive farming, then the Amazon could not support large populations. If it could not support large populations, then it could never have produced cities, kingdoms, or complex societies. The people who lived there, science concluded, must have always been small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers and simple gardeners drifting through the trees, leaving no lasting mark. The most influential voice behind this idea was an American archaeologist named Betty Meggers, pronounced M-E-G-R-S, who spent decades arguing that the tropical rainforest was a place where complex civilization was, in her words, essentially impossible. The environment set a hard ceiling, she said, and no human society could break through it. It was an elegant theory, it was scientific, it was taught to generations of students, and it was, we now know, spectacularly wrong. But before we tear it down, we have to be fair, because there were very good reasons people believed it. The Amazon hides its history with almost supernatural efficiency. In the stone-building traditions of Egypt or the Maya, ruins endure for thousands of years, standing proud above the sand or the jungle. But the peoples of the Amazon did not build with stone for a simple reason. Across enormous stretches of the basin there is no stone. There are no quarries, no bedrock outcrops, no mountains of granite. So they built with the material they had in endless supply. They built with earth, and earth, in a hot and wet climate, behaves very differently from stone. Wooden posts rot, thatch roofs dissolve. Earthen mounds soften and blur under 2,000 years of torrential rain until they look like nothing more than gentle natural hills. And then, over all of it, the forest grows. Within a century of abandonment, a plaza becomes a thicket. Within 5 centuries, a city becomes a jungle indistinguishable from any other. Add one more factor, the most tragic of all, which we will return to in detail later. By the time European explorers penetrated deep into the Amazon in the 1700s and 1800s, the societies that built these earthworks were already gone, erased by a catastrophe that had swept through generations earlier. The explorers did not see a living civilization decline. They arrived after the funeral, and they mistook the empty, overgrown ruins for a land that had always been empty. So the myth of the Green Hell was born. An inhospitable wilderness, a primitive frontier, a place where nothing great had ever happened. There was just one problem with this comfortable story. A handful of stubborn eyewitness accounts, written centuries earlier, told a completely different tale. And the man who wrote the most important of those accounts had sailed down the entire length of the Amazon River and claimed to have seen something extraordinary. His name was Gaspar de Carvajal, pronounced Carvajal, a Spanish friar, and in the year 1542 he was aboard the first European expedition ever to descend the Amazon River from the Andes to the Atlantic. The expedition was led by a conquistador named Francisco de Orellana, pronounced Orellana, and it was by any measure a nightmare of hunger and desperation. But as their boats drifted down the great river, Carvajal recorded what he saw along the banks, and what he described did not match a green hell at all. He wrote of villages that stretched for kilometers along the shore, so close together that one was barely out of sight before the next appeared. He described populous provinces, roads leading inland, and well-organized settlements ruled by powerful lords. He wrote of one province so densely inhabited that the shore, in his words, glittered white with the great cities. He even described fleets of canoes coming out to meet them and organized armies defending the riverbanks. For centuries, historians read Carvajal's chronicle and dismissed it. It was, they decided, the exaggeration of a desperate, frightened, half-starved friar, a man perhaps inventing grand cities to make his expedition sound more important or to justify its failures. After all, when later explorers traveled those same rivers, they found no cities at all, only jungle, only silence. So Carvajal was branded a liar, or at best a dreamer. Hold that thought, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. 2 accounts of the same river, separated by a century or two, that could not both be true. Either the friar imagined an entire civilization, or something unimaginable happened in the years between his voyage and the ones that followed. For 400 years, science sided with the empty jungle, and then, in the 21st century, a new tool arrived that could finally settle the argument, not with old books and disputed memories, but with hard, undeniable data. That tool did not dig into the ground. It flew above the trees, and it was about to make the invisible visible. The technology is called LiDAR, pronounced LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. And to understand why it revolutionized Amazonian archaeology, you have to appreciate the exact problem it solves. The great enemy of the archaeologist in the rainforest is the canopy, that unbroken green ceiling of leaves and branches. From an airplane, you see only the tops of trees. From a satellite, the same. Even the sharpest photograph cannot show you the ground, because the ground is buried under 100 feet of living vegetation. For most of history, the only way to find a site under the canopy was to walk into the jungle on foot and stumble across it, a method so slow that mapping even a single ruined settlement could take an archaeologist an entire career. LiDAR shatters that limitation. Here is how it works. An aircraft, or in some cases a drone, flies over the forest carrying an instrument that fires hundreds of thousands of laser pulses toward the ground every single second. Each pulse races down, strikes something, and bounces back, and the instrument measures, with extraordinary precision, exactly how long the round trip took. From that time, it calculates distance. Most of those pulses hit leaves and branches and bounce back early. But out of the hundreds of thousands fired every second, a small fraction slipped through tiny gaps in the foliage, all the way down to the actual surface of the earth, and bounce back from there. The genius is in what happens next. Powerful software gathers billions of these measurements and then does something almost magical. It identifies and deletes every single point that struck vegetation, keeping only the points that reached the true ground. The forest, digitally, is stripped away. What remains is a bare Earth model, a perfect three-dimensional map of the land surface itself, as if every tree on Earth had been lifted away in an instant. And when archaeologists first pointed this tool at the Amazon and removed the trees from their screens, they could not believe what was staring back at them. Where the naked eye saw only endless, chaotic jungle, the LiDAR map revealed geometry, perfect straight lines, right angles, rectangular platforms arranged in careful groups, circular plazas, raised roads running arrows straight across the landscape for kilometers, canals, reservoirs, mounds arranged in deliberate patterns that no natural process could ever produce. Nature does not build straight lines and right angles at that scale. Only intelligence does. The green hell, it turned out, was not empty at all. It was covered in the fingerprints of engineers. And nowhere would those fingerprints prove older or more astonishing than in a quiet valley on the eastern slopes of the Andes, in a corner of Ecuador where a volcano had been keeping an incredible secret. The place is called the Upano Valley, pronounced Upano, in the Morona-Santiago region of eastern Ecuador, where the Andes Mountains begin to melt into the Amazon basin. And in January of the year 2024, a team of archaeologists led by Stephen Rostaing, pronounced Rostaing, of France's National Center for Scientific Research, published a study in the journal Science that rewrote the timeline of the entire Amazon. The story had actually begun decades earlier. Traces of ancient settlement in the Upano Valley were first noticed back in the 1970s, and Rostaing himself had been excavating there since the 1990s, slowly, painstakingly, one pit at a time. But it was only when the government of Ecuador funded a LiDAR survey of the valley and the trees fell away on the screen that the true scale of what lay hidden finally became clear. What the laser revealed was breathtaking. Spread across an area of roughly 300 square kilometers, the survey exposed at least 15 distinct settlements, 5 of them large, linked together into a single integrated landscape. At the heart of it lay complexes of earthen platforms, rectangular in shape, built by carefully cutting and flattening the tops of hills, then raising level surfaces of packed earth. On these platforms once stood houses and ceremonial buildings, grouped in tidy clusters of 3 to 6. And the number of these platforms was almost incomprehensible. The team counted around 6,000 of them. 6,000. One of the great central platforms measured 140 meters long by 40 meters wide. The core of one settlement, a place called Quilamope, covered an area comparable in size to the plateau of Giza in Egypt, or the Great Avenue of Teotihuacan in Mexico. And connecting all of it was a network of roads, some of them running perfectly straight for as far as 25 kilometers, wide avenues of earth cutting through the valley, some sunk deep below the surrounding land, flanked by ditches. Around the cities lay agricultural fields and hillside terraces, laced with a web of drainage canals growing corn, manioc, and sweet potato. This was not a village. This was a landscape completely engineered by human hands. But here is the detail that stunned archaeologists most of all. The detail that forced every textbook to be rewritten. The dates. Radiocarbon evidence showed that the Upano Valley cities were first built and inhabited beginning around 500 years before Christ, and they thrived for roughly 1,000 years before being abandoned somewhere between the year 300 and the year 600 after Christ. Think about what that means. These cities were rising in the Amazon at the same time the classical civilizations of ancient Greece were flourishing on the other side of the world. They are, by more than 1,000 years, the oldest complex urban societies ever documented in the Amazon. While Rome was still a growing republic, engineers in the Ecuadorian jungle were laying out avenues and raising thousands of platforms. Hostain gave this way of living a beautiful name. He called it garden urbanism, a form of city that does not crowd its people into dense stone blocks, but instead spreads them across the land, weaving homes and plazas together with farms, orchards, and canals into one continuous living system. How many people lived here? That is honestly still debated, and we should be honest about it. Some researchers on the team estimate the valley's population peaked somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 people. Other estimates run higher, past 100,000. The truth is we do not yet know for certain, and any channel that gives you a single confident number is selling you certainty that the science has not earned. What we do know is that this was a large, organized, enduring society. And as for what ended it, the leading suspect is the very thing that had made the valley so fertile in the first place. Towering over the region is a volcano named Sangay, pronounced Sanguai, still active today. Its ash had enriched the soil for 1,000 years. But a volcano gives, and a volcano takes. Hostain suspects that catastrophic eruptions may have finally driven the people away, burying their gardens under the same ash that had once fed them. The Upano Valley proved that the Amazon could birth cities, and ancient ones. But to see the full ambition of these lost engineers, we have to travel south, into the flooded plains of Bolivia, where the laser revealed something that looked, for all the world, like pyramids. The region is called the Llanos de Mojos, pronounced Llanos de Mojos, a vast expanse of tropical savanna and forest in the Beni region of northern Bolivia, in the southwestern corner of the Amazon basin. It is a strange and dramatic landscape. For 4 to 10 months of every year, depending on where you stand, more than half of this entire plain vanishes underwater as the seasonal floods roll in. It is one of the last places on Earth you would expect to find a city, and yet hidden here was one of the most sophisticated. The first hints came, oddly enough, not from archaeologists, but from oil company geologists and a geographer named William Denevan, pronounced D-E-N-A Van, who back in the 1960s began publicizing the existence of enormous prehistoric earthworks scattered across these plains. For decades, the mounds and causeways were known but poorly understood, dismissed by many as too scattered and too simple to represent anything like true urbanism. Then, in May of the year 2022, a team led by the German archaeologist Heiko Prumers, pronounced Pruo Merz, published a study in the journal Nature based on airborne LiDAR, and the flooded plains gave up their secret. In the Casarabe region, pronounced Casa Arabe, the laser revealed a settlement network unlike anything previously confirmed in the Amazon. At its heart stood 2 enormous primary sites, and around them radiated a whole hierarchy of smaller ones, more than 180 mapped earthen mounds in total, linked together across a landscape by an elaborate system of raised causeways and canals. The scale covered at least 4,500 square kilometers, and the architecture was monumental. The largest mounds rose in stepped, terraced platforms, some crowned by tall, narrow structures reaching toward the sky that observers could not help but compare to pyramids. These were not natural hills. These were deliberately raised civic and ceremonial centers, with platform mounds, sunken plazas, and enclosures, all oriented in consistent directions, suggesting shared beliefs about the cosmos. Radiating outward from these centers ran the causeways, straight raised roads of earth that allowed people to travel across the plains even during the floods. And beside them ran canals for water management, for transport, and for fishing. The Khazar people had solved the fundamental problem of their environment. In a land that drowns for half the year, they lifted themselves and their food above the water, building islands of dry, permanent settlement connected by an all-season network. This civilization flourished between roughly the year 500 and the year 1400 after Christ, nearly 1,000 years of continuous development, ending only shortly before Europeans arrived in South America. And a follow-up study published in the year 2025 found evidence that this dense settlement was fed, in large part, by intensive cultivation of a single crop grown at scale, maize, ancient corn, farmed with enough sophistication to feed a permanent, concentrated population. Now here again, honesty demands that we present both sides, because that is the standard of this channel. When the Nature study estimated that the Khazar society contained at least 10,000 people and practiced what the authors called a form of urbanism, not every scholar agreed. Some researchers have pushed back, arguing that a smaller population, working steadily over many centuries, could in principle have raised these same earthworks slowly, without ever forming a true city in the sense we usually mean. The debate over exactly how many people lived here and whether the word city is the right word is still very much alive in the scientific literature. But what is no longer in doubt is the sheer, deliberate scale of the engineering. Somebody, over many generations, reshaped an entire flooded province into a functioning, integrated, monumental landscape. And Khazarabe and Upano were not alone. They were two members of a much larger family, a whole mosaic of lost societies scattered across the Amazon, each one different, each one now emerging from the shadows. Because once archaeologists knew what to look for, they began finding these hidden worlds almost everywhere they pointed the laser. Consider the island of Marajó, pronounced Maraja, a landmass at the very mouth of the Amazon River, roughly the size of Switzerland, where the great river finally meets the Atlantic Ocean. Here, from around the year 400 to the year 1300 after Christ, flourished the Marajoara culture, pronounced Marajoara, studied in depth by the archaeologist Anna Roosevelt. The Marajoara built enormous artificial mounds, some rising many meters high and stretching for hundreds of meters, raised deliberately above the seasonal floods to hold their villages, their cemeteries, and their dead. And they left behind some of the most beautiful and sophisticated pottery ever produced in the ancient Americas, elaborate funerary urns covered in intricate designs, the kind of refined ceremonial art that only emerges in a society with specialists, hierarchy, and time to spare from mere survival. Then travel to the headwaters of the Xingu River, pronounced Xingu, in the southern Amazon of Brazil, and you reach a place called Cuhicugu, pronounced Cuicuugu, in a region studied for years by the archaeologist Michael Heckenberger, working closely with the Cuhicuro people who still live there and are the descendants of its builders. What Heckenberger documented was a network of towns and villages occupied from around the year 1200 to the year 1600 after Christ, connected by broad, carefully engineered roads that ran between them in straight lines, oriented to the cardinal directions. These settlements were surrounded by defensive ditches and wooden palisades and organized around large open plazas. They were not isolated dots on the map. They were an integrated regional system, clusters of towns linked to satellite villages, the whole landscape planned and connected. Heckenberger called them garden cities because between and around the settlements lay a managed landscape of orchards, fields, ponds, and working forest. And then there are the geoglyphs of Acre, pronounced Aesh-Cri, in western Brazil, where deforestation in recent decades accidentally exposed hundreds of gigantic geometric earthworks, perfect squares, circles, and interlocking shapes, carved into the ground as ditched enclosures, some of them hundreds of meters across, dating from roughly the time of Christ to the year 1300. Their exact purpose is still debated, likely ceremonial, likely gathering places, but their precise geometry across such an enormous area speaks again of planning, cooperation, and shared meaning. Put all of these together on a single map: Upano in Ecuador, Casarabi in Bolivia, Marajo at the river's mouth, Cujicugu on the Xingu, the geoglyphs of Acre, and dozens more sites besides, and a stunning picture emerges. This was not one empire. There was no single Amazonian Rome ruling it all. Instead, there was something arguably more remarkable: a vast and diverse patchwork of independent societies, speaking different languages, building in different styles, spread across an area larger than the continental United States, each of them having independently found ways to build complex, enduring, engineered societies in a place that science had declared impossible. But how? How do you feed a city on soil that everyone agreed was too poor to farm? The answer to that question is perhaps the greatest achievement of these people, and it lies quite literally in the ground beneath their feet. It is a kind of earth that, by every rule of tropical soil science, simply should not exist. It is called terra preta, pronounced T-A-I-E-R-A, preta, which means, in Portuguese, black earth. And it is one of the most extraordinary human inventions you have never heard of. Remember the foundation of the old green hell theory: the poor, acidic, orange feral soil that could not sustain intensive farming. That was real. That is the natural soil of most of the Amazon. But scattered across the basin, in patch after patch, always precisely where ancient people once lived, researchers kept finding something completely different. Deep, rich, black soil, sometimes 2 meters thick, dark as coffee grounds packed with nutrients, and extraordinarily, almost unbelievably fertile. In the middle of the poorest soil on Earth, these islands of black gold sit like miracles. For a long time, people assumed it must be natural, some quirk of ancient river deposits or volcanic activity. It is not. Terra preta is manufactured. It is, in the truest sense, a technology engineered by human beings over centuries, and we can read the recipe in its chemistry. The ancient Amazonians took their poor native soil and systematically transformed it by adding a specific mixture of ingredients. The single most important was charcoal, vast quantities of it, produced not by burning wood fiercely in open flame, but by charring it slowly at low temperature with limited oxygen, a process that leaves behind stable, porous black carbon. Modern scientists have a name for this substance now, and a booming industry around it. They call it biochar. To the charcoal they added the organic wealth of daily life: broken pottery, fish bones and animal bones, ash from their hearths, food scraps, manure and plant waste, all worked into the earth year after year, generation after generation. And the result was chemically transformed soil. The porous charcoal acts like a microscopic sponge and a coral reef combined. Its countless tiny chambers hold on to water and nutrients that would otherwise wash away in the heavy tropical rain, and they provide a vast sheltered habitat for beneficial fungi and bacteria, the living engine of healthy soil. The bones and ash loaded it with phosphorus, calcium, and other minerals. Together, these ingredients turned dead, hungry dirt into living, self-sustaining farmland capable of feeding dense populations year after year in the heart of the jungle. These people did not simply endure poor soil. They defeated it. They invented better ground. And here is the detail that borders on the miraculous. the part that has modern soil scientists studying terra preta with real urgency. In many places, this ancient black earth is still fertile today, more than 500 years after the people who made it disappeared. Local farmers in the Amazon actively seek it out and prize it, and some report that it appears to regenerate, that you can dig it out and it slowly regrows its depth over the years. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly where sensational channels overreach. Whether terra preta truly regenerates itself and by what mechanism is still an open scientific question, and researchers are genuinely divided on how far that self-renewal goes. What is not in dispute is its astonishing endurance. A soil deliberately built by human hands 2,000 years ago is in many spots still among the most fertile ground in the entire Amazon. That alone is one of the most successful long-term engineering projects in human history. And terra preta was only one half of how these people mastered the forest, because they did not only transform the ground. According to a growing body of research, they transformed the trees themselves. For centuries, we called the Amazon a pristine wilderness, a virgin forest untouched by human hands, the very definition of wild nature. A growing body of science now suggests that this image, too, is partly an illusion. Consider a striking pattern that researchers have documented across the basin. If you walk through the Amazon and catalog the trees, you find that a surprisingly large share of all the individual trees belong to a small handful of species, and many of those dominant species just happen to be the ones most useful to human beings, trees that produce edible fruits and nuts. The Brazil nut, the cacao tree, source of chocolate, palms rich in oil and fruit. These useful species appear in concentrations far higher than random chance would predict, and, crucially, they cluster most densely precisely around the sites of ancient settlements and earthworks. In a landmark study published in the journal Science in the year 2017, a team of researchers led by Carolina Levis argued that this pattern is no accident. Over thousands of years, they proposed, the peoples of the Amazon actively cultivated, protected, transplanted, and encouraged the trees that fed them, gradually reshaping the very composition of the forest to favor useful species. The forest we see today in this view is not purely wild. It is in significant part a garden, an orchard grown so old and so vast that we mistook it for nature itself. The Amazon, they argue, is in part a human artifact, a living monument to generations of careful tending. Now, once again, the standard of this channel demands that we give you both sides honestly, because this is a live scientific debate, not a settled fact. Other researchers have pushed back firmly on the strongest version of this claim. They point out that much of the intense human modification may have been concentrated near rivers and settlements rather than spread evenly across the entire basin, and that vast stretches of the deep interior forest show only light human influence. The question of just how much of the Amazon was shaped by human hands, whether it is mostly a garden or mostly wild with cultivated pockets, remains genuinely unresolved, and any honest account has to say so. But even the most cautious scientists now agree on the core point that would have been heresy a generation ago. The people of the Amazon were not passive passengers in an untamed wilderness. They were active managers of their environment, shaping soil and forest alike over immense spans of time. And their influence is still legible in the living landscape today. Which brings us to the darkest and most important question of the entire story. If the Amazon was home to cities, to engineers, to a civilization that built roads and pyramids and manufactured its own fertile soil and cultivated its own forests, then where did they all go? How does a world like this fall so silent that the people who came after would deny it had ever existed? The answer is one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of our species, and almost none of it was written by the sword. The event is known to scholars as the Great Dying, And to understand it, you have to go back to the year 1492 and to what happened when two halves of the human species, separated for more than 10,000 years, suddenly collided. For all those millennia, the peoples of the Americas had developed in complete biological isolation from Europe, Asia, and Africa. They built their cities and their civilizations, but they did so without ever encountering the crowd diseases that had evolved in the dense, animal-packed cities of the Old World. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. For thousands of years, these plagues had swept through Europe and Asia, and the survivors had passed down hard-won immune resistance to their children. The peoples of the Americas had no such history and no such defenses. Their immune systems had never seen these invaders. And when Europeans arrived, they brought the invaders with them, not as a deliberate weapon, but simply in their bodies, their breath, and their blood. What followed was a biological catastrophe on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The diseases did not politely wait for European explorers to carry them from village to village. They ran ahead. They spread from person to person, community to community, along the same trade routes and river networks that had once carried goods and ideas, racing across entire continents far faster than any European could travel. This is the crucial, haunting point. In many regions, the pathogens arrived years or even decades before the first European ever did. The plagues went first, and the explorers followed into the silence. A study published in the year 2019 by researchers including Alexander Koch and Simon Lewis at University College London attempted to measure the scale of the loss, and their central estimate is staggering. They concluded that the population of the Americas before contact was around 60 million people, and that within roughly a century of European arrival, that population collapsed by about 90%. Around 56 million people, dead in a few generations. 56 million. At the time, that was close to 1/10 of the entire human population of planet Earth, erased. It is by this estimate one of the largest population catastrophes in all of human history. And now return at last to our Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, drifting down the Amazon in the year 1542, describing mile after mile of villages, of populous provinces, of shores glittering with cities. He was sailing down the river in the earliest years of contact, at the very beginning of the collapse, perhaps catching one of the last glimpses of the living Amazonian world before the plagues finished their work. He was not lying, he was not dreaming, he was one of the very few Europeans to witness these societies while they were still standing. By the time the next waves of explorers arrived, a century or two later, the diseases had already swept through. The cities were empty. The fields had been swallowed by regrowth. The roads had vanished under new forest. The survivors, their numbers shattered, their societies broken, had scattered into the small mobile groups that later Europeans encountered and assumed had always been the natural state of Amazonian life. The explorers arrived after the apocalypse and mistook the ruins for the original condition of the land. The green hell was not a wilderness that had never known civilization. It was a graveyard so thoroughly reclaimed by the forest that the world forgot there had ever been anything to bury. And the forest itself may carry the fingerprint of that death. Some scientists have proposed that the sudden collapse of tens of millions of farmers and the regrowth of forest across their abandoned fields all over the Americas pulled so much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that it measurably cooled the entire planet, contributing to the cold period known as the Little Ice Age. That link is still debated, and we should hold it lightly rather than state it as fact. But even as a hypothesis, it is staggering to consider. The death of the Amazonian world may have been written not only in empty jungle, but in the very air of the whole earth. So where does all of this leave us? What do we do with a lost world that we are only now, 5 centuries later, beginning to see clearly? The first thing it demands of us is humility, and that is worth sitting with for a moment. For 200 years, some of the most brilliant minds in science looked at the Amazon and confidently declared that complex civilization there was impossible. They were not foolish. They reasoned carefully from the evidence they had. But they made one fatal assumption, the same assumption that trapped so many before them. They assumed that because they could not see something, it was not there. The cities were beneath their feet the entire time. The evidence was in Carvajal's chronicle, in the black earth, in the strange straight lines under the trees. They simply were not able to see it until a new tool taught them how to look. And that raises a question this channel will keep returning to again and again. What else are we confidently declaring impossible right now, today, simply because we do not yet have the tool that would let us see the truth? But there is a second lesson here, and it may turn out to be the most valuable of all because it reaches out of the ancient past and into our own uncertain future. We live in an age desperate to solve two enormous problems: how to feed a growing population without destroying the land, and how to pull carbon out of an overheating atmosphere. And it turns out the engineers of the ancient Amazon were quietly working on both 1,000 years ago. Consider terra preta. That ancient black earth is not only fertile, it is a carbon sink. The stable charcoal at its heart is exactly the kind of locked-away carbon that climate scientists now dream of burying in soil to slow global warming. Modern researchers studying biochar and modern farmers adding it to depleted fields are in a very real sense trying to reinvent a technology that Amazonian societies perfected before the fall of Rome. The ancient Amazonians found a way to build fertility and store carbon in the same act, and we are only now catching up to what they knew. Consider their whole way of living, the garden urbanism of the Upanu Valley, the flood-adapted engineering of Casarabi, the managed forests full of fruit and nut trees. These were dense, enduring human societies that did not clear-cut and sterilize their environment, but wove themselves into it, enriching the soil and the forest even as they fed themselves from it for 1,000 years and more. In an age when we are watching the Amazon burn and fall to make room for cattle and short-lived farms, the ancient example is not just a historical curiosity. It is a working, proven model of how human beings once thrived in this exact place without destroying it. The people we once dismissed as primitive savages may turn out to be among the most sophisticated environmental engineers who ever lived. And yet, for all we have learned, the honest truth is that we are still standing at the very edge of this discovery. We do not know how many cities still lie hidden under the canopy, unmapped and unstudied, because only a tiny fraction of the Amazon has ever been surveyed by LiDAR. We do not know for certain how many people truly lived here, with serious estimates for the whole basin ranging from a few million to well over 10 million, a debate that is far from settled. We do not fully understand why some of these societies collapsed even before the Europeans and their diseases arrived, or how their many languages and cultures connected across such vast distances. We do not know the names these people called themselves, the stories they told, the gods they honored on those earthen pyramids. Every rainy season, the forest reclaims a little more. Every year, tragically, deforestation destroys ancient earthworks that no archaeologist ever recorded, erasing pages of human history before we can even read them. The race to understand this lost world is running against the clock. But perhaps that is the most important truth of all. The story of the ancient Amazon is not a closed book from a dead past. It is an active investigation unfolding right now in our lifetime, with the most important chapters still unwritten. Beneath that green ceiling, a civilization waited in silence for 500 years for us to become humble enough and clever enough to finally see it. It makes you wonder what other lost worlds are still out there, patiently waiting under the surface of everything we think we know. And that is exactly what this channel exists to uncover. If this journey through the hidden Amazon moved you even a little, then please Subscribe to Nexus Revelare Xenos, because our investigations are only getting deeper, and the technologies history forgot are only getting stranger. Leave a like, it genuinely helps this small, independent channel reach more curious minds around the world. Share this video with someone who still believes the jungle was always empty, and prove them wrong. And tell us in the comments, which lost world should we investigate next? The sunken cities said to lie beneath the sea, the vanished builders of the Sahara when it was green, or the truth behind a civilization swallowed by the sands of time? Your answers decide where we travel next. Thank you sincerely for watching all the way to the end, where the Nexus reveals the authenticity behind the illusion. We will see you in the next investigation.